Good afternoon or good morning if you're listening from a part of the world that's a bit further behind us in time zones. Welcome to the latest of OAG's webinars. I'm Becca Rowland, I'm a partner at Midas Aviation and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. Our topic today came about from a conversation about American Airlines last month when they cancelled flights as they didn't have enough pilots. So we thought it'd be interesting to focus a bit more today on where else the supply side issues might hold airlines back from fulfilling demand as that demand comes back. We will of course be looking at the current state of the industry as well, as we always do, and drawing on OAG's extensive data for that. As usual, you will get the webinar, link to the webinar after this, and it's available on the OAG website. If we have time, we'll take questions and answers at the end, but please send your questions in as we go through, because we, as far as we can, we just pick up the questions as we're going through and weave them into the conversation and the answers. So do use the chat that you can see to provide, put your questions forward. Today, trying to explore these topics, we've got OAG's Chief Analyst, John Grant, here with me as usual. We're not going to talk about the football, are we, John, this week? Usually you're keen to talk about the football, but I think this week we'll just stick to aviation, won't we?
I think we will, Becca, just keep it straight and on the narrow.
Great, okay. We've also got, very pleased to have Buddy Anslinger here, who's close to becoming a frequent flyer with us. I think this is your third time now joining us with one of the webinars, isn't it? But I think last time you had a Christmas jumper on and we could see you. So
exactly.
Yeah, so Buddy's got 30 years experience providing network planning and strategic advisory services for airlines, airports and aviation related clients worldwide. And he spent over 20 years at Continental and has particular expertise in network planning. So yeah, welcome back, Buddy, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for asking.
We've also got Matt Colling, who's the EVP for content at OAG, and Matt's provided some of the data we're going to be looking at on some of the slides. So thanks for joining us again today, Matt.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, great. Before we start, we're just going to launch a poll. We've got a question that John came up with, which we thought might be interesting to get us going. So the question is, I think I'm just launching it now. You should be able to see it. When do you expect the transatlantic market between Europe and North America to be reopened to all nationalities? Is it August 21, September 21, October 21, November 21, or later than that? So if you could use the poll to give us your answer, and we'll keep an eye on it, and when we think most people have answered, we'll close the poll. Very interesting, as I can see the answers coming in. I'm not sure, John, why you came up with these dates. You were thinking that maybe the sentiment would be that it's going to be this year?
Because I have a flight booked for the 25th of August and I'm trying to get some reassurance from people.
That's a very good reason. Okay, we're still
I'm not sure I am. I don't think that's going to be
very reassuring for you, John.
No, it's not. I think I might go and cancel my flights now.
Okay, we've still got a few more late voters voting here, so just hold it for another few moments.
Pretty impressive. 3/4 of people voting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Though I saw the number went down, so somebody's changed their mind, obviously.
Yeah. Can the other 23% vote for August, please? It would be very helpful.
Okay, I think we're just about there now. So I'll close it now. Not sure what happens when I hit the close button.
We can share the results.
Poll result view. Okay, so the poll results, almost half our audience, which is quite substantial today, is saying it's going to be later than 2021. So John, if you're planning to travel in August to the States, that's not looking great, is it? Is that, Buddy, is that a surprise to you seeing those results here?
I wouldn't have said later than 2021. Well, I mean, when you say all nationalities, that's pretty broad. It might open up to EU, let's say in September or something. But if you use the word all nationalities, then it might be later than 2021, as the majority voted for.
Yeah, very interesting. Well,
I'm sorry, I should say EU and UK now.
Yeah, yeah, we
Sorry.
are Europe still. We're just
Yes.
not part of the EU.
Exactly.
So yeah, very interesting. And obviously, from your perspective, I think Americans can travel to the UK more easily than we can travel to the UK to the US. So there's as with a lot of the markets, and we'll be talking about this later. There's just such an imbalance, isn't there? Still.
For sure. And it seems odd to me that there's not reciprocity, but there's not right now.
Okay, thanks very much everyone for that. And let's move on to our first slide with some data. John, you're the one who lives and breathes this sort of data here. What we're showing, same format of data we show every time. It's the last 12 months with how global capacity is versus the same month in 2019, and then broken down by region. We're seeing a positive trend, aren't we? This is the continuation of a positive trend. This week we've got it's -31, or this month it's -31% compared to 2 years ago. Last month we were reporting -39%. So that's looking good, isn't it?
It is, but we keep coming back to this chart, Becca, and reflecting on the different paces of recovery and the sudden changes in position of respective markets because of another COVID spike. And the improvement we've seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks is really based around Western Europe and specifically, the leisure markets within the European Union, heading off to the sunspots and fighting for the deck chairs on the beaches. So it's, that's a very important part of what's happened, and the US domestic market, as Buddy can attest to, has been going gangbusters since about March, has consistently been improving and improving. So the headline number looks good, but some of the detail behind it is absolutely, awful and beginning to turn negative again. In Asia, as you make the point, if you exclude China, which is actually up on July 2019 capacity, and that is all domestic. Indonesia is running at less than half the capacity this week than it had the week before. Malaysia continues its national lockdown and is unlikely to be released from what we can see before October. Australia and New South Wales are back in lockdown with its subsequent impact on the Tasman bubble, and Qantas now saying they will not be operating international services before 2022. So it really is a mixed bag, and we're seeing more and more outbreaks of the Delta variant throughout Europe and other parts of the world. And at 79.8 million seats this week, we might actually be at one of the busiest weeks this year. And if we see more lockdowns and the UK, although it's open for business from the 19th of July, we have another amber gamble on the traffic light system tomorrow afternoon with our well-qualified Minister of Transport giving us his latest pearls of wisdom. So it's a really, really frustrating situation, and that whole thing Buddy said about reciprocity. Regulators and governments clearly aren't talking to each other about what they're trying to do and what steps they're going to take.
It's interesting. So, when I look at this chart at the bottom here, there's lots of positives, especially North America here, this green line, Europe really picking up with a grey line. And yet, underneath the surface, there's just still so much uncertainty. We've talked about uncertainty, every month now for 16 months, and sometimes it's been uncertainty about rules and regulations, and it keeps bubbling away, doesn't it? We are seeing more capacity, but it's as long as markets are uncertain, it's very difficult for travellers to book.
Yeah, and we know that some of the quite a lot of the recovery we've seen in the last 4 or 5 weeks has been international services, but they are international short-haul services, with airlines working really hard to stimulate demand with some very cheap fares, and it's marginally profitable at best for these airlines. And with an economic recovery apparently underway, the price of oil is beginning to escalate. Airlines will have no or limited control over the price of fuel at the moment. They certainly wouldn't have been buying forward. So it's a challenging time, and it's even harder probably now. And it's quite sad that 12 months on from July 2020, we're not really in a much better position than we were.
And of course, the airlines have less cash. Everybody's got less cash to make decisions with, I guess. Let's have a look at the same data, but just for the last 8 weeks. So a little bit more granular, we can see what's been happening over the past few weeks. So globally this week, we're at minus 32.9% of capacity compared to July, the same week in July in 2019. The same sort of pattern really we're seeing, aren't we? The North America doing, you know, better than everywhere else. But again, Asia, just this number hiding what's happening in China versus what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you know, North America is really the United States. Let's not assume anything else. Canada is still locked down and struggling, and it is all domestic. I mean, Buddy, you've probably never seen such a buoyant domestic market in the US as you have now.
No, that's true. I mean, it is mostly domestic, but then as you indicated in Europe as well, there's also short haul international, the Caribbean and Mexico that have really cranked up as Americans. You know, those countries really rely on American tourism, and so I think they all but had to open their doors to Americans, virus or not, at this point.
And we've been hearing about, and actually know people ourselves, making quite strange journeys to try and get around the rules. So people in the Middle East spending time in Spain or in, you know, Mallorca or somewhere. So they basically sit it out, what would be a quarantine period out there before coming into Europe. People going to Mexico from the UK in order to get into the US. And we were talking to, I think to you yesterday, about people traveling, the sort of COVID travel. What did you call them, John? Tequila shots.
Yes.
You know, are those sort of journeys the minority? And I mean, we can't put a number to them because we've got no means to measure them really. But are they just sort of anomalies and interesting facts, or are we seeing quite large numbers of people moving in strange ways that we wouldn't have expected before? It's not the straightforward, you know, there and back holiday type stuff.
Well, I think there's two types of travel here. The first part is the people, let's say Europeans going to Mexico for a while and then trying to come to the United States. I think that's a minority really, but there is apparently quite a growing amount of people that are, particularly from South America, Colombia, Peru, et cetera, that are coming to Miami to get their COVID shots. And American and the South American carriers have added capacity in between those countries and Miami. It's just so that, you know, the people that can't get shots in their own countries or don't trust the types of vaccines in their own countries can come to the U.S. and have their choice. From what I understand, the Miami airport's even set up a vaccination center within the airport, so you can, I guess, technically fly in, get a shot, and go back home same day.
Wow. Interesting, isn't it? Different take on pivoting.
I think you know, Buddy's absolutely right. You know, it is the minority who are doing this, and it's complicated, and you know, you've got to have a lot of confidence about what you're doing to take these indirect routings, which are for many reasons on 2 separate tickets and 2 separate bookings. But people are going to do it, and you know, it's the law of unintended consequences that the regulators just do not understand. You know, it's almost like looking at an ant's nest. You know, if you think you block it up, an ant will find a way to get to where it wants to get to, and that's the behavior we're seeing. And once one person does it, another follows and another follows. So yeah, Mexico City, get your transfer product sorted out.
So this data obviously we're looking at here on the screen is capacity, but John, where are you seeing traffic numbers? I mean, obviously, you know, if capacity is a third down on where it was 2 years ago, traffic is much more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's probably 15 to 20% of drift, percentage points of drift. So you know, in many cases, demand is still minus 40 to 50% of what it has been. Certainly not the case in the US, and you know, we've got some data on the TS numbers that will attest to how strong the recovery has been. But airlines are still struggling to stimulate demand, because despite the reopening, I think every soundbite from every politician is, you travel at your own risk and be warned, be wary of short notice changes in travel requirements. And the last thing people want to do is to get stuck in a Premier Inn at Heathrow or some other country for 10 days.
And we've seen exactly that. We're not going to show data for it today, but for the Tasman bubble, which we've sort of looked at with interest, and that initial pent-up demand was clearly satisfied when it opened back in April, and the traffic is still, or the capacity is still growing, but it has eased off, hasn't it? And as you say, there were government ministers talking about how risky it is, and it doesn't help stimulate confidence. So
no, not at all.
Okay, let's move on and have a look at some slightly different data. So this is looking at various countries. We always like to give you a bit of a country breakdown. The first column here is domestic capacity versus the same point 2 years ago. And then the second column is international capacity. So you can see that difference of domestic and international. And we can see, the US is minus 13% for the domestic capacity, so really not too far off where it was 2 years ago, and Mexico minus 12%. What we have on the right in the yellow is the proportion of the population that have been either fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated, and this has come from Our World in Data, which is a really excellent free data source. If anybody hasn't tapped into that yet, it's worth having a look at all the different data that they have available. So we just thought it'd be interesting to put the two together, and we've got another slide that shows it in a slightly different way, but it really shows that there's no correlation at this point between whether international markets are open and the level of vaccinations, and that's for a whole load of reasons. But we're all sort of banking on vaccinations helping us get out of this, but we're not quite there yet, are we?
No, and a lot of people, if they saw this data, would wonder why they bothered to have a vaccine if their pure objective was to travel. If you look at the United Kingdom, at least 67% of the population have been partially vaccinated, and yet we're still at minus 72% on international capacity. And Canada, which is suddenly caught up very quickly, and nearly 70% of the population there have had at least one vaccination, minus 81% on international capacity, and that's just across, most of that is just across to the US. So some big disconnects there that just defy logic. But I think the other stark numbers here, Becca, are when you look at Asia Pacific and the levels of international capacity compared to July 2019. Most of those countries are at only 10% or 15% of their normal capacity levels, and still have a long way to go in terms of vaccinations, and many of those countries do not have production facilities. Many of those countries are reliant on aid from various organizations to start their vaccination programs, and I was reading this morning that only 3% of the population in Africa has been vaccinated to date. So we've got some real challenges to reconnect the world and reopen international travel, because if we follow the data, the US to Canada should be open, the US to the United Kingdom should be open, the US to Spain should be open, Canada to Spain, Canada to the United Kingdom. These markets should be open, but for some reason, either the politicians can't count or they're worried about their votes.
So we are seeing, I guess what we're seeing is just a wide range of, it's still sort of policy and politics that are driving openness, rather than sort of something as independent as a vaccine, proportion of the population who've been vaccinated, sort of an independent data point. It's about policy, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, let's have a look at the data in a slightly different way. So here we've plotted those on a chart. So along the bottom we've got the international capacity versus the same week in 2019. So this is just international, versus on the vertical axis here the proportion of the population with at least one dose of a vaccine. So we've sort of divided it up into 4 quadrants, and we tried naming them to see if there was a sort of a common theme with each of these. I think you came up with slightly different and more provocative names than I did, John, but I've taken them off in the end because they don't completely follow. But you know, it is interesting, isn't it, just to see this big cluster, aside from obviously Brazil and Peru. You know, all of these are Asian markets, Asian countries with where international travel's really just not happening, but still got fairly low levels of vaccination. But they're really worried about the Delta variant, aren't they, at the moment, and some, you know, new lockdowns and high numbers of cases at the moment. So they do, you know, rightly have concern, you know, need reason to be worried, don't they?
They do, and you know, if you look at each of these quadrants, the bottom right-hand one is the reckless and the stupid in terms of countries, some of whom have never even closed their borders during the whole COVID-19 event. And as Buddy was saying, Mexico, so dependent on US tourism. You know, the economy would take a big hit if it wasn't allowed to travel. Russia and Colombia as well. The bottom left-hand quadrant, I think, is fascinating because it's almost like a cascade. They can all cascade out in terms of capacity once China decides or feels that it is in a position and confident enough to reopen its international borders. And from everything we see, that is very unlikely to happen in 2021. And I can't believe I'm saying that, because at the beginning of the year, you know, we thought probably halfway through the year everyone would be back and traveling or beginning to travel regionally from China. But they're in no rush to do anything and to stimulate international demand. They've covered everything with their own domestic services. And then you have those in the top right-hand quadrant who perhaps are following some of the data points. And then you have obviously the UK and the Canada in the top left-hand quadrant, who have formed the Commonwealth Club, very conservative, unable to count and interpret the data, and basically allowing their airlines to collapse and suffer further damage through the rest of the summer. It's interesting when you plot it like this. I think it would be really interesting to see how these move. And if we come back and visit this on the next webinar to see who are the movers and how they've moved and by how far.
I mean, of course, though, you know, I take your points, but you know, if you look at the UK, well, any of these countries, international capacity is a function of both ends of the travel route, isn't it? So, you know, the UK could be open, but other places are not allowing travellers in, and so maybe it's not just the UK that's looking to close.
No, it is.
Example, but it is the problem when you've got something that depends on 2 countries, and there's just so little trust between countries at the moment.
And you know, the whole aviation industry has been built and is founded on bilateral acceptance of each other's requirements, acceptance of each other's airlines, acceptance of each other's maintenance and engineering and safety protocols and checks. And we can't seem to get past this particular point. Immensely frustrating. You know, some of these countries have done a lot of work to get themselves in the right place, only for the other end of the route to say no.
And I think the point you make about China is really well made. I mean, some of the Our World in Data vaccination numbers for China, they were the ones that I was least sure about. I think they don't get as many sort of data points as they do for some other countries. But China this week put out a press release saying they've now vaccinated, or they've given out 1.34 billion doses of vaccine. So it was basically the equivalent to the population, I think. So, you know, they are rapidly increasing their vaccination program. But as you say, we're not seeing any sign of China opening. And I know, speaking to Gary Bauman, who was on the webinar this morning, you know, he was saying that we were probably looking at, and I think we were saying this a while ago, we were looking at February next year when the Winter Olympics were on as being maybe a point that China would open. But now the sense is maybe it's later. I'd be interested if anybody has any more sense of when they think China might open. If you pop it into the questions and let us know, what your thoughts are, if you've got any particular insights about when China might open. But Gary was saying maybe not till the end of next year, or perhaps even into 2023. It doesn't really bear thinking about, does it?
Scary, very scary.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. This is a slide we've shown very similar data in the past, where we used the snapshot feature in OAG's schedules analyzer to take a look at what the schedule was showing as capacity by week at an earlier point in time, and comparing that to what's actually happened. We sort of couldn't resist really having an "I told you" or "we told you so" slide. I think back in March and April we were saying we couldn't see the summer materializing in the way that the airline schedule made it appear, and that's exactly what's happened. We look back mid-March, mid-April, mid-May, mid-June, and consistently capacities come out. So where we are today is quite a long way short of where we thought capacity in mid-July would be some months ago. We're going to continue to see this trend, John, aren't we?
Yeah, I think we are, Becca. We at this week we will probably be very close to the peak capacity week for the year, unless something significant happens. It's quite likely that we could see the total global market back down at about 74 million seats by the end of September. If we see another couple of breakouts and spikes in particular countries and changes to travel rules. It is about confidence, but it's, I think we recognised early, and this is nothing that the airlines can really manage. They are putting capacity out there in the hope that it will be operating, and they have to cut it out at short notice. Typically, within 4 to 6 weeks of when flights were planned to operate, they're being taken out. I think British Airways have started cutting their flights, long-haul flights, from the 15th of August onwards. And that's about it. It's about a 4-week period, and they just have to hope and see that something will change and something will break. But it's not going to happen. And I think we are, apart from the US and the domestic market, there are many other places around the world that continue to struggle to put the capacity back.
Buddy, let's bring you in here, because obviously this picture we're showing here is a global one, and the US has been very different. Is what John's saying something that resonates, that maybe this week or round about now is perhaps close to the peak capacity that we'd see this year, and how different is it in the US?
Yeah, I do agree with that it's pretty close to the top of the peak, and then come September, October, all the airlines will start to pull back. Normal seasonality will wane. And so, you're already seeing airlines pulling leisure destinations down or out completely for September and October, and even their planned growth for September, you're seeing that pulled down or out completely as well. So, I think this probably for North America will be the peak of the year, frankly.
Wow. Okay. Very, very sobering comments, really.
Becca, I guess, apart from seasonal holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, that probably means this is going to be the peak week until this time next year.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Particularly for North America, you're already seeing capacity in many places at equal to or even greater than 2019, and so and this is the peak in a normal year. This would be the peak week anyway, or peak time of the year, and so it won't go much above this, and until, like you said, John, until next summer probably.
Okay, let's change the subject slightly. This is we've got a couple of slides here that Matt's provided us with a slightly different way of looking at some data that we've looked at before. It's the same sort of snapshot data, but Matt, you've been able to produce it in a slightly different form. And we're looking here at just how airlines have been changing the schedule. How soon before a flight do they make those changes? John, I think you said it's typically 4 to 6 weeks before flight is due that we're seeing sort of changes, but
well, cancelled.
or cancelled rather. This is more, this data here is more about the changes that they're planning coming up, so not the cancellations. But is it, or Matt, do you want to talk about what we're seeing here?
Thanks, Becca. Yeah, so this is, as you say, this is the schedule changes, and so this particular example is American Airlines, and essentially it's the same information as the previous chart, which has become known as the erosion chart in my world, and seeing those sort of the schedule being carved away on a frequent basis, be it fortnightly, monthly, 6 weekly. But now with OAG bringing our schedules data into our new Metis platform and our flight information product suite, we're able to pull this data in somewhat more granular data. It's easier to get to, and so we're able to look airline by airline. And we'll talk about American Airlines cancellations in June in a bit, but that was what prompted me to look at this. And so at the top, the first sort of chart, you can see the American Airlines schedule. It's a very simple count of flights planned, as it was on the 1st of February. And then as each chart, as you move down the page, you're kind of moving to the first Monday of each month through till the 5th of July. And so you can see that kind of step change between what the schedule was showing in February to what it shows in March, as American removed a huge percentage of their flights that they had planned for April. And then as you move down to the third chart, you can see the May flights coming out. And then as you move down to the May chart, you can see kind of June and July flights have been removed, and so on and so forth. A couple of things perhaps to note. The little dip in the middle of the May and June charts show the 4th of July. So leading up to the 4th of July, American had flights scheduled, but actually took those out. Again, less people traveling than perhaps expected. And I wonder whether or not that's a lack of international travelers coming in, or whether or not that is domestic flights. I haven't quite had a chance to look at that. But as I say, it's an alternative view of the data that you've seen before, and seeing how the airlines, in this case American, maintain the wider schedule up until kind of a point in time when they take the next slice away. And we've spoken before about why that might be, and why this approach of eroding the schedule is used. Quite probably and possibly it's due to the kind of they want the bookings on those flights if they can get them, but then if it doesn't look likely, then they don't want to have to manage all of the rebooking of the passengers at once, so they're doing it in tranches.
I think it's just it's really, I know we go through this data repeatedly, but it's really important to understand, because I still see reports in the media about airline capacity is looking great for the autumn, it's all going to come back, but I think the evidence is that that's just not what's going to happen, is it?
No, exactly that. I think we as a company have prided ourselves on the quality of the schedules data, and it's used in such a wide range of different ways for people to plan and predict what's going to happen. But unfortunately, over the last sort of 12 to 15 months, the schedule is not quite as reliable as it used to be with respect of knowing if those flights will operate. If the airline operates the flight, then you've got the data of what it will be, but there's now this sort of
there's more volatility
of doubt. Absolutely.
Just more volatility, I think, isn't there? Yeah, so we've got the same sort of data for Ryanair. We put a couple of airlines in. Matt ran the data for a number of airlines, and it was interesting just to see how different each airline was, and how just very distinctive patterns. But we've just included two here. But you can see here clearly Ryanair's doing this process on a much more regular basis, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that's right, and also that they revisit the schedule, and so the data for the flight, for April. Yeah. And I perhaps should have said that the idea of the color scheme is simply that the red dots, the more red the dots, the less number of flights there are on that day, the more green, the higher the number. So just to give you that visual representation. But you can see for April, for example, Ryanair reduced their schedule more than once for their for their April, whereas American typically only made that reduction for a particular month's flights once. So they kind of look at that month's flights and reduce it down to what they really think will happen, whereas Ryanair have taken a couple of bites at the same range. So not dissimilar, still kind of chipping away, but not quite the big slices.
We've got a question in from Olaf. How much do you attribute the airline strategies? Are they maximising revenues with high yield sales? So how much do you attribute also to airline strategies to maximise revenues with high yield sales with a limited amount of capacity? In other words, is it possible that airlines are also deliberately limiting capacity without being hurt as much as it appears? John, do you want to?
This is Buddy. I don't think that's true, because I just don't think there's that much high yield traffic right now.
Yeah, that would be my instinct as well.
And I think
there's still a surplus of capacity, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think in American's situation, maybe perhaps not Ryanair's, you know, if American has 6 flights a day in any given market, and they see that, you know, that one flight is not booking up particularly well, they'll cancel it, and knowing that they can reaccommodate people on the other 5 flights.
Yeah, I think there is one market where we're seeing that happen, and that is completely artificial, where the Middle East carriers are having or have been operating to Australia with limitations on passenger numbers, because only 3,000 international passengers can, I think, arrive in Australia in a week. And when you then divide that by the number of services being operated, you know, these carriers are essentially capacity, they are capacity constrained to probably only a 10 or 15% load factor. And with people being desperate to get back, there are apparently 50,000 Australians who are still unable to get back to their mother country. Then the yields from Dubai and from Abu Dhabi and Doha have tripled in some cases. But I agree with Buddy. I mean, generally, airlines are in a position where they need to demonstrate that they can generate cash. And the best way to do that is to stimulate as much demand as you possibly can at this moment in time.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks very much, Matt. That's very interesting to see that way of visualizing that particular data. We have some other new data, or I don't know if it's old data or new data, but just presented in a different way. John, you've been working with some of the team at OAG and have got this data about schedule changes and the average days before changes are made by an airline to a schedule, which we've sort of summarized in this chart. We've got a number of airlines, some of the larger airlines in the world. The grey bars are the number of flights operated for a particular week, the first week of July, so it's quite recent data. And then the orange dot relating to the right-hand scale is the average number of days before changes to those flights by that airline were made. So quite a lot of variation, isn't there, really, between the end 60 days or more and at the bottom end 20, 30 days.
Yeah, and you know, if nothing else, this shows what a difference confidence can have in an airline's behaviour. So, you know, the 3 carriers who are closing and finalising their schedules furthest out all happen to be major US domestic carriers where the market is open, and you know, there's not a lot of uncertainty about travel, and they're able to plan and finalise 6-7 weeks in advance quite comfortably, and operate large volumes of flights. And then the rest of those carriers, who are major global airlines, are facing so much uncertainty, you know, that they are making changes at short notice. They're not operating as many flights as they traditionally would do, and they're struggling to make sense of what's happening and how their business is being impacted by regulations and openings and closures around the world. I think it's quite interesting when you look at airlines within the same alliances as well. So Lufthansa and United are in the same Star Alliance. They have an 18-day differential, and Air France and Delta and SkyTeam have a 17-day differential. Now, in terms of how they're reconciling their code share flights, where they're putting each other's operating prefixes on someone else's service that is operated, so they're behaving as the marketing carrier. Getting that alignment of schedules is becoming even harder for those carriers. And, you know, we should typically expect everyone to be up at this 60-day sort of notice because they have confidence in the market, they're seeing the bookings coming through, there's no surprises about to confront them. But this encapsulates the whole challenge that every airline in a market that has a reliance on international capacity is struggling with at this moment in time.
Maybe we'll come back to this in another webinar and perhaps look at some different points in time to see how this has changed, because it's clearly something that we expect has changed a lot over the last 18 months, and we'll continue to do so. We've got some TSA data here, some positive numbers here in the last month, and in the last few weeks we've actually had 3 days where the number of passengers going through security at US airports has exceeded the number for the same day in 2019. So this is the scale. This comes to why I guess American ended up cancelling flights, because they didn't have enough pilots, because actually there was the speed of recovery here that people hadn't quite expected the market to come back quite so strongly in the US. John, Buddy, would you?
Yeah, but Paddy, I mean, you know, from my perspective, it looks like everything's heading in the right direction. I don't think you've done much traveling, but obviously a lot of people in the US are out and about at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, I think that the reason we exceeded 2019 probably on certain days is because the 4th of July shifted, you know, day of the week or something, and so people could leave a day early or a day later, something like that. But yeah, we're definitely trending the right direction and filling up airplanes. And you know, I think one of you alluded to the fact that at some point, you know, the airlines will have to start to revenue manage traffic and start to get the fares up again, because I mean, it is mostly cheap traffic, right, or relatively cheap traffic right now.
Yeah, we've got some data on fares in a bit from OAG. So what did we see happen last month with American? But the chart here on the right shows, the grey bars show the scheduled flights, and the yellow line shows the cancelled flights. And it was this particular spike around the 20th of June. So not huge numbers of cancellations, given that at other times there are other spikes, but this was the one that was caused by having too few pilots. And I think the press coverage I saw said that American were going to take out about 1% of flights over the following 4 weeks just to manage the schedule. And that's what we see in this little chart in the left-hand side. The grey line was where the capacity prior to this point of the 20th of June, and the yellow line was the capacity afterwards. So over a 4-week period, and this dip obviously is the 4th of July, they've trimmed the capacity a little bit, so done what they said. But all the airlines are facing the same challenges, aren't they, about bringing back staff, pilots, other types of staff as well, getting them cleared through security, getting them trained and so on.
Yeah, and remember, with all the retirement of aircraft, a lot of, you know, bringing a pilot back isn't just as easy as saying, okay, you're back, you know, go fly the airplane. You know, if they've retired the aircraft that he used to fly, he has to be retrained. And each of the airlines only has so many training facilities that they can retrain the pilots on new aircraft types. And so, you know, I think there's probably a backlog at each of the airlines, and you know, they might have the right number of pilots, they just don't have the right number of pilots for each aircraft type at this point.
So this isn't a problem that's being faced elsewhere in the world yet, really, because demand is lower in other parts of the world. But at some point, every country, every airline is going to go through the same process, aren't they, trying to match up growing demand with actually having the right staff in the right place, trained to do the job.
Becca, I think this is a real challenge, and something that, you know, from a logistical perspective, airlines are going to struggle with, and we will see short notice cancellations. I think American got a bit of bad press about this. You know, it just seems incongruous to someone who's outside of the industry. How can an industry that's on its knees and got lots of spare people kicking around suddenly have to cancel flights because it doesn't have pilots? And, you know, they didn't really dig around the story. And actually, these cancellation rates are lower than cancellation rates in the same weeks in 2019. But why let the facts get in the way of the story for a journalist? But but there are more important things at play here. You know, to give you one example that will play out in Europe, as more and more countries implement track and trace and have data on vaccines and who's been in close proximity to people who are still have been infected, it's likely that airlines will, at midnight in their operations centre, believe they have a completely 100% rostered operating day about to occur, and then at 3 o'clock in the morning start receiving text from people who are rostered to be in at 6 o'clock saying that they're unable to come in because they've been advised to stay at home. Which
is exactly what happened yesterday at Heathrow, isn't it? That 100 security guards were pinged saying, you've been in contact with somebody with COVID, you have to self-isolate now for a period of time.
Yeah. So, you know, airlines do not have, and certainly don't have at this moment in time, the depth of resource to have standby crews at an airfield, and particularly large amounts of standby crews to fill those gaps. So as we recover and as we grow out, we are going to see these types of occurrences happening quite regularly, and we have to understand why they're happening rather than, you know, blame the airline. It's not the airline, it is the airline operating within, you know, the rules that have been set.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and we have just used American as a sort of a way of working our way into this topic and what are the supply side issues. Yeah, we're aware that this applies to lots of airlines, and it's not their fault.
No, and it will be the same for those of you who are traveling who want your Starbucks coffee at 7 o'clock in the morning. You know, they will be short staffed, not only because people will not be able to come in, but because, as you said, Becca, they won't have passed all of the necessary securities. And then, of course, if someone did get through security and they weren't supposed to be there, that would be another great story for a journalist. So the industry has got to manage its recovery very carefully. And, you know, we've all got to be a bit sympathetic to what's going on.
Having said that, I mean, the slide here has stories from longer ago, but there were pilot issues well before the pandemic, weren't there?
Yeah, well, absolutely. You know, pilot issues, yeah, air traffic control issues. I mean, there's always been this story of one particular place in Germany where it takes nearly 2 years for an air traffic controller to be passed fit to operate. So, you know, we've got all of those rebuilding processes to go through, and it's going to take time. And we will see these sort of things happening. No way to avoid them.
Yeah, I saw that Ryanair are going to hire lots of pilots, but it seems like they're investing in some of the training as well. So I guess we're going to see, I don't know personally so much about pilot training, but would airlines normally invest in that themselves, or do they expect the pilots to arrive fully trained?
I think when you get, I mean, Ryanair, every airline invests in its pilots, you know, and many of them are attached with various loan schemes so they can get their necessary qualifications and have to commit to numbers of years service with a particular airline before they can be contractually released, or they have to pay it back. But I think, you know, it's not only the number of pilots. If you look at the demographics, and particularly the age demographics of pilots, there is a large tranche who probably were coming up for retirement in the next 5 years. And some of those may have just said, you know what, I can't be bothered to come back.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough time. So staffing is going to be an issue as we move forward. Let's have a look at something slightly different. We've sketched out here using the sort of snapshot feature again in our analyzer. We've looked at the time of day of flights at various airports, and we've got a couple of slides here. So this shows some of the airports big airports in the Americas, and the next one shows some airports in Europe and the Middle East. We wanted to see if, as traffic is coming back, as capacity is coming back, are we seeing more peakiness, more, you know, the sort of wave pattern of connectivity coming back? Are we seeing more flights in the shoulder periods, the sort of early morning, late afternoon? Where in the day is the capacity coming back? So it's quite interesting, isn't it, seeing it, John? I mean, it's varied, but we're definitely seeing some peaks and troughs still, and yet we don't think there's really a lot of connecting traffic.
No, and I think that's Buddy will know best. I mean, he did some great scheduling and hub and spoke stuff with Continental in their various airports, but it's airlines are building back on their hubs. That's probably natural. That's what you would expect.
If you look at Dallas and Atlanta and Chicago, well, less Chicago, but Dallas and Atlanta have so many banks during the day. That's why it looks kind of flat. Is that throughout the day there's people arriving and departing and they're connecting banks, and so it doesn't look very peaky because they have so many and they brought them back. Chicago a little less so, and then Mexico City a little less so as well. But yeah, I mean, the connecting banks are definitely back. They just have to be.
But Becca, I mean, if you flip on to the next slide and some of the other airports, you can see some of the patterns here. I think we need to be really, really careful about, and this is another aspect of the recovery. Minimum connecting times have not dramatically changed since pre-pandemic days. So most airlines are still operating to the same minimum connecting criteria. And that's been absolutely fine because there's been no connecting passengers. It was the last thing that they needed to worry about. But as we see more connecting passengers returning, as the transfer process becomes more complex, passengers are probably going to have to reaffirm that they've got double vaccines and are fit to fly. In that transfer process, aircraft are going to need deeper cleaning. It's likely we're going to see longer turnaround times on aircraft and longer connecting times for passengers. And some of those connecting flows are really time sensitive. It's not on here, but for anyone who's flying to Sydney, there is a curfew at about 11 o'clock in the evening, and you need to be out of the airport and have departed as an airline by that time. And at the moment, many of the Asian and Middle East carriers schedule flights to arrive in Sydney about 2100, turn the aircraft around in an amazingly quick time for a wide-bodied aircraft, 90 minutes in some cases, and I think I've even seen a 75-minute turnaround. Now, if the connecting times are extended out, then those aircraft are going to be stuck in Sydney for an overnight stay, and then the airline's complete hub and spoke network will need readjusting, and what happens in Sydney would ripple through to somewhere like Heathrow or Los Angeles, where airlines will have to reschedule their connecting banks. It's the implications of what's happening, or potentially what could happen, need to be very carefully considered. And that's, I think, in part why IATA continue to ask for the waiving of the 80-20 slot rule for winter 2021-22.
I think this question of minimum connect times is one we're going to come back to, aren't we, in the future, I'm sure, and we'll try and do a bit more diving into the data and see if we can see evidence of how they're changing. It's not something we've done yet, and I don't think we're sort of expecting to see that change in place yet. But as we see recovery happening, I think we're definitely going to be having to look at that and then try and understand the implications for airports. If maybe they won't change, but if they do, as you say, there's quite a lot of implications for how many rotations you can fit in, where aircraft have to overnight, and just patterns that have built up over years of flight scheduling may change. But Buddy, do you have a sense of that at all? You've got a lot of network planning. Do you expect the minimum connect times to change?
Yeah, particularly when you add on the complexity of COVID passports or checking your status of being vaccinated. It's just one more hurdle that travelers are going to have to go through, and agents are going to have to, or maybe not agents of the airline, but I don't know, government agents. Someone's going to have to check that, and just it keeps adding time to the connecting times.
Buddy, do you think, I mean, we've seen a lot of network experimentation in the US domestic market, carriers adopting hub bypass strategies and low frequency services to leisure markets. Is that likely to stick, or do you think, in a recovery scenario, everything will return to the hub?
I think yes. I don't think there's one answer for that. Because the airlines had the airplane and the crews, it was very cheap to try experiments with a bunch of these airplanes, like throwing mud on the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think some of it will work. And seasonally or even year round, they'll keep some of those services. But then some of them you've already seen the airlines pull them down or take them out completely. So I don't think there's one answer for that.
Mm.
Okay, we've got some data. We talked about fares earlier. We've pulled some data from OAG Traffic Analyzer about fares on some US domestic routes. It's interesting. These are some of the larger markets in the US, and what we're seeing is a pattern of generally the fares came down since the beginning of the pandemic, and with some peaks and troughs and movement around, but they seem to be moving upwards now. Is that how you're seeing it in the States, Buddy? Are we seeing airlines able, I guess as demand comes back, they're able to raise those fares a bit to get a bit more of a handle on the revenue management?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, there's the data point on the far right should probably be April 21.
Oh gosh, sorry about that. Yes, it should be April 21.
But I just as March is when the recovery started here in the U.S., and so I would guess that the revenue management people at each of the airlines could finally start to push some levers to increase fares. It'd be interesting. I know this is the most recent data you could get, but it'll be interesting to see what the summer data looks like.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, we don't have that quite in yet. There's always a time lag with the fare data.
Yeah.
Okay, so still looking at some of the sort of supply side issues, we've pulled some data here from STR, which has publicly available data with about hotel occupancy and revenue for the US, which I thought was quite interesting because it showed that room rates in urban areas in the States were down about 50% on 2 years ago. At airports, they were down about a third, and then at resorts, they were sort of fairly flat. And we know, talking to people in Asia, they've seen sort of almost an opposite pattern, that the resorts have done worse than some of the urban areas. Sort of interesting, I guess. Hotels, on the one hand, have capacity, so they could have reduced rates because they've got this excess of capacity, but equally, some of them are having to keep rooms vacant, I guess. They have to have social distancing, and some of their capacity can't be used. But generally, it is a supply and demand situation here. The rates have gone down as they have excess capacity.
Yeah, no great surprise. One of the features, I think, is, domestic tourism tends to expect a better deal than international travelers.
Yes, typically they won't pay quite so much, will they?
And therefore it's a bizarre thing. They expect it to be cheaper and they expect the same quality, if not more. So it's frustrating. Gary Bauman was saying this morning that many hotels in Asia have looked to maintain typical rates, even though the market has flipped to being essentially domestic travellers, but by adding or providing added value. So spa days, beauty treatments, and all of those sort of things to try and maintain the yield and keep the revenues coming through.
So Gary was also saying that to cut costs, many of the hotels are reducing the staff numbers, but that's also leading to what he would say is a noticeable lowering of standards. You're paying a lot for a hotel, you sort of expect a certain level of staff interaction and staff attentiveness. I don't know if you know, Buddy, is that something that you're aware of in the States as well, or in North America generally? Are we seeing staff?
I don't know about staff reductions. I know entire hotels or entire wings of hotels have been shut down during the pandemic until things get better, or until they get enough staff to support the level of rooms that they're offering.
It's really it is just as difficult for hotels, Becca, as it is for the airlines. We know from our own experiences and talking to some of our clients in the Caribbean that hotels have to leave a room vacant for 48 hours after guests have left to ensure that any COVID threat is minimized. and you know the room has been sterilized and sanitized, and it's still left for 48 hours. So they're effectively working with 1/3 of their capacity in many cases.
Yeah, it might be. It actually might be more difficult for hotels during this time period than airlines, because you know a hotel you can't move. It's where it is. Whereas an airline, if it was subject to a 48-hour grounding or something, we'd say fine, we just won't fly to that city or country.
Yeah, that's very true.
Our final slide here is looking at car rental, which I think is sort of the opposite. They've actually been able to do a lot. They've been, I mean, Hertz is a particular instance, but I think a lot of the car rental companies, when a lot of their business depends on airports, demand went down. So actually they've sold a lot of their stock, and we know that Hertz actually sold 180,000 vehicles. So, coming back from that, what we're seeing is very high rates for car hire, which I guess as the market recovers, that's another sort of factor that might dampen demand if people are going to get a great rate on a flight down to Florida, but then spend a lot more than they used to on car hire. As the sort of the penny drops about how we're going to spend money, where it's going to go, how's that going to affect the whole travel ecosystem? It's quite challenging, isn't it?
This is really, quite there's a couple of angles, not just this, but I currently have a car hire rental, and I'm just one person for Florida for 14 days, and that cost me £800. If I wanted to book the same car now, that cost me £2,400. That's more than the cost of the airfares and the whole holiday. And multiply that, this could suppress demand further in those classic destinations where there's a large component of fly dry, and that certainly is the case in the Europe to US market. And then of course you've got all the costs of the PCR testing and other such things that are costing £120 per person that people are going to have to pay. The reality is the airlines are struggling as it is, but demand could be significantly suppressed by the other parts of the travel chain ecosystem trying to carve out too much yield too quickly and not stimulating demand.
Very difficult, isn't it? And the extent to which everybody has to share the pain. I mean, it's been painful for all of these companies, isn't it? Everybody operating in travel in one way or another. We've come to the end of an hour, so I think we'll leave it there. We've answered most questions as we've gone along, so thank you anybody who's asked questions. I'm aware Mike has asked about African airlines, and we just can't fit everything in every webinar, but I think last time we did speak quite a bit about Africa. OAG does have lots of data on Africa, and so please do have a look at what's available on the website there, and we will come back to Africa in future webinars, I'm sure. The next webinar is going to be on September the 22nd. We are taking a break in August, as we did last year, but thank you very much for listening in today. Thank you very much, John and Buddy, for all your insights. I don't know if you've got any final parting shots about the industry or the whole supply and demand question as we finish. Buddy, do you have any final thoughts? Anything you've been itching to say that we haven't given you a chance to say?
No, I mean it's been a great conversation today. I think hopefully the U.S. is a model or for the rest of the world as everybody gets vaccinated, and things will start to pick up elsewhere besides just North America.
Yeah, great. And John, any comments?
Just frustration that we need to get past this point of ad hoc lockdowns, short changes, and accept we've got to live with this. We can't live in bubbles. It won't work.
Matt, I'd ask you if you've got any comments, but I think we've probably covered off your data really nicely today. Thank you for the extra slides today. So thanks all of you for joining in the discussion. That's been great, and we'll see you again in September. Thanks very much.
Thank you.